Okay, so let's speculate a bit on what Dendro is going to be as an element in every aspect of the actual element, going from the resonances to the reactions, and just given my take on how it's going to interact with the world. So first I want to say is that I think them adding an element pretty much halfway through the game's lifespan is going to be a bit of a weird situation, or it's going to like make or break the element as a whole, purely because you're changing a fundamental part of the gameplay by adding another element that might interact completely differently or weirdly with the rest of the elements and the rest of the whole world, because half of the game has not been made in regards to that element, whilst it has been in regards to the others. So that's my take on how it's going to work. It might make or break it, you know, you never know. My instinct is telling me that it's going to be a very weird release when they first initially release the element. It's going to be very odd. People aren't going to know exactly how to use it, and when they figure it out, it either will be busted or completely useless, but we'll have to wait and see for that. But let's just jump into the speculations for the resonance. In regards to the resonance, it's extremely difficult to actually think up of some like solid and balanced kind of ideas for this, but you have to kind of think of something impactful, unique, and kind of cool as well, because the current resonances are pretty good. You know, you have Pyro 25% attack, Hydro healing bonus, you know, and then Geo is an assortment of buffs. Then you also look at the opposite side of the spectrum, which is a terrible one, which is Electro, which pretty much does absolutely nothing. And so the ideas that I came up with here, I have three that I'm going to spitball here. So we have a damaging aura. Now this one's a bit of a on the hay side, a bit iffy about this one, but it's kind of like a constant whirlwind around you that is doing, let's say, 2 to 3% of your character's attack damage, your active character's attack damage, you know, every second, let's say. And you know, this idea is more just like a constant damage, unique thing that you just have passively as you're playing the game. But I can see the broken side of this one if you do get a character that stacks attack up to like 3k to 4k or 5k even, if you can do that. Second idea that I got was the Thorns aura, or damage reflect in a sense. If you've ever played Minecraft or any game that actually just has this kind of damage reflect kind of a thing, but it pretty much works off of if you get hit by an enemy, a certain percentage of the damage they inflicted onto you is reflected back onto them. So if they hit you for 1,000 and you have 10% damage reflect, they'll get hit for 100. And the reason I recommend this one, or I suggest this one even, is because it will be quite useful against enemies that have high HP and pretty high damage. So the Kairagi is a good example. The Mirror Maiden is a good one because she has an extremely high amount of HP. Maybe not so high damage because I haven't really gotten hit by her, but she has extremely high HP, so having any added damage go onto her would be extremely useful. Now obviously the tinkering that you have to do with this is what percentage of damage should be reflected. You know, I think 25%-ish is usually a good mark, because you as the player aren't actually getting hit by as much damage as you're actually outputting with your own weapons and characters. So, and I also, yeah, you're really only ever taking about 5-ish k damage at a time, from my experience at least. And so the most you'll ever reflect with that is like, you know, 1,000. So that's really not much extra damage. So 25% damage reflect is not much. Another thing we have to take into consideration is, should it affect through shields or not? So if you are wearing a shield and you have this Thorns aura, should it still reflect? And from my understanding, yes. Or from my kind of own perspective, I feel it should, because I don't see why it shouldn't. But if they take this idea and they don't actually let it go through shields, then completely understandable. You could do a very cheesy AFK composition with a Zhongli and whatnot. So that is that. I'm pretty sure those are the only aspects that go into doing this whole damage reflect, is the percentage and should it go through shields. Obviously there are a bit more mathematics involved with the whole how should it affect the enemy's actual resistances and whatnot, and should it reflect elemental damage, or should it if it takes in elemental damage and then reflects physical, or should it just reflect the same element back? It's a bit of mathematics that has to be worked out, but the general concept is the Thorns aura, or damage reflect. And the last one that I'm going to suggest, this one is personally my favorite, and I kind of would really love to see this one, and it's an echoing attack effect. Now, obviously, you can kind of speculate what that means just by hearing it, but pretty much what it means is that only your normal and charge attacks are echoed for about a certain percentage of damage. And so here I wrote down 25 to 50% of damage should be echoed only by your normal and charge attacks. The reason I specify normal and charge attacks is because echoing elemental bursts and echoing elemental skills could potentially absolutely bust the game to a different level, and Dendro Resonance would be a must-have. So that's why I specified to normal and charge attacks that echoed for 25 to 50% of the damage as a whole. And I feel like this one could be a really cool game changer, so characters like Razor, where he's a very normal and charge, or maybe not so much charge attack, but he's a very normal attack styled character. Eula, her Q is useful, but her normal attacks are very useful. Yoimiya, again, recently a new character that focuses around normal attacks, could become even stronger with this echoing effect. And just in general, it would make certain parts of the game a lot easier to do without extreme amounts of work. So daily commissions, you don't have to put, much work into that. Also, it's just a cool effect. It's very unique in a sense, and I don't see it becoming too overpowered. Okay, so let's move on to the reactions now. And we're going to start off with Pyro, because that is the only one that we actually 100% know what happens when Dendro and Pyro interact with each other. And it's a burning effect. Ticking damage over time, which I presume will scale off of elemental mastery and character level, much like the already known transformative reactions, which I'll mention throughout this whole kind of section of reactions, specifically that transformative reactions type thing. Moving on to Cryo and Dendro, I've got about 4 different names for this kind of effect or reaction itself, and that's something like Decay, or Withered, Wilted, or even Weakened. And I've got 2 different effects that I'll suggest for this one, which is the parallel to the Superconduct, i.e. negative 40% elemental shred, which is again that parallel to Superconduct's 40% physical shred, which I think would be a super cool and good way to buff characters. Obviously, they would push into that 100% elemental resistance shred with characters like Sucrose and Kazuha, and also Zhongli on top of that. But again, obviously having a parallel with the other one would be super cool. And the second effect is a 20% attack reduction to enemies. Now this one is a bit of an up and down one, because we don't necessarily need it, because enemies actually don't do that much damage as a whole. But there are a handful of enemies, specifically enemies like the Kairagi, or potentially a Ruin Hunter. Other enemies I don't really know that do too much damage. But there's a few enemies that just do a bit too much damage. And having this 20%, maybe even 30% damage reduction to them would be quite cool, and it's also a unique effect that we don't actually have in the game. Going on to Hydro, for this one I came up with a bit of a poison or toxic effect as my first kind of idea, and this would be pretty much identical to Burning, which is a damage over time that scales with elemental mastery and character level, again like that transformative reaction. That's my first idea. My second idea I didn't actually come up with, I think my brother came up with this one, but the Sludge, Mud, or Bogged effect, like the actual combination of dirt and kind of muddy kind of hydroness, kind of create this bogged effect, which pretty much is kind of hard to think of what it would do, but it would kind of slow them, let's say by 50 to 60%, i.e. being the only reaction that really does slow enemies down. And it could also on top of that add a bit of a disorientating effect where the enemies actually kind of get confused and they might start attacking each other, which I think would be super cool if the enemies did actually start attacking each other because of this elemental reaction. Now moving on to Electro. Now this one is really hard to actually come up with names and even concepts, mainly because Electro by itself doesn't really operate well in the actual game itself, but I digress. Moving on to the name that I came up with, which is the only one, which is the Singed effect. Now I really like the name of this one, and the ideas that I came up with as well are kind of unique in a sense, but also kind of copy some in-game aspects as well. And so the first one is you have a mini Mona burst effect. And so for those who don't know, Mona, her elemental burst, when it hits an enemy, it marks them with kind of this astral effect, and then the next attack they take, the damage of it is actually multiplied by a very high number. And so how this reaction would work is once the enemy is hit by the reaction, they are marked, and so then the next attack has a moderately to greatly reduced effect to Mona's actual burst. And to further buff this reaction and make it stronger, the damage is multiplied by a percentage of your elemental mastery, though this whole reaction, if used, has a potential to be completely busted if comboed with Mona herself. But on top of the whole mini Mona burst effect, I did also specify here that they can also use the whole attack reduction by 20 to 30% effect here as well, because it would also make sense. As for Anemo, which is the last one that actually does anything useful or kind of cool, I thought of a cool concept of having a bleed effect, and you obviously may be wondering why not Dendro Swirl, and because it just doesn't sound right to me. It would be the equivalent of saying Geoswirl. It just doesn't kind of sound right. It sounds made up and weird. So I feel a bleeding effect would be kind of cool. You can kind of think it of a razor wire effect or a kind of leaf wind effect. Characters like Byakuya from Bleach have this kind of attack where they just slice you with a lot of petals. It can be kind of similar to that, but obviously it is another damage over time effect, much like the burning and toxic effect that I previously mentioned. And again, this would scale off of elemental mastery and the character level. And as for Geo, it would just be the same Geo crystal stuff, but like it would be Dendro crystals. Nothing really to comment here. Okay, so now to move on to explain what I meant by transformative reactions, just to, back up what I'm saying here a bit, and as to why they should be transformative and not amplifying. And so pretty much for all the reactions except Geo and Anemo, they would be transformative for pure balancing reasons. And for those who don't know what transformative reactions are, they are all the electro reactions pretty much, and these reactions are not affected by crit rate or crit damage in any way, and they're also not affected by attack percent or attack in any way, and they can't crit at all. And on top of that, they've got a static number of damage that they do depending on your elemental mastery to your also character level that's causing the reaction. So for instance, level 40 Bennett applies Pyro and a level 90 Baal reacts it and causes overload. The damage will scale off of the Baal's elemental mastery and actual level. Now going on to a hypothetical, if all these reactions that I just specified, the Pyro, Hydro, and Anemo one specifically, if they were all amplifying reactions, then we can see a massive break in the game's functions, and just the game would get crazy, because the damage of those actual dot effects, so damage over time effects, could scale up to 30,000 damage a tick per dot, which could equal up to 90,000 damage a tick, not including your active damage that you are doing with your character. These are all just dot effects. That's why these reactions should be transformative, so they only scale off of elemental mastery and character level, so they don't reach a monstrous amount of damage. Because the last thing we want in this game is to get to the point where we don't even actually have to play it. Now I hope you guys enjoyed this little video speculating on what Dendro may be when it releases 1 year from now. I had fun trying to create these names and effects and put them together so they make moderate sense. Obviously this could all be wrong, and it's anyone's guess what MiHoYo will implement, but oh well, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much for watching, see you in the next one.